Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Baker Institute. We're very happy to have you all here. It's my pleasure to welcome John Bolton to the Baker Institute this evening. Since the Institute's founding some 15 years ago, we have attempted to advance our national public policy debate by inviting speakers who are well informed in their field of expertise, who represent different sides on the issues, and thought-provoking in their opinions. Tonight's speaker assuredly fits that bill. I have known John Bolton for many years in government service, and characterizing John as thought-provoking is an understatement at best. John and his wife Gretchen, like Francoise and I, have a daughter who graduated from Yale. In terms of fair and equitable treatment, I hope that John has had the same experience that I've had, namely being at the receiving end of the pointed comments of Yale daughters that they can give their fathers on their career accomplishments, but especially the lack of their accomplishments. A native of Maryland, a graduate of Yale, and a lawyer by profession, John Bolton entered government under President Reagan in 1981 as General Counsel to the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. He later became Assistant Administrator for AID, Assistant Attorney General, and under President George Herbert Walker Bush, and appointed by Secretary Baker, Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. In 2001, our Speaker re-entered government under President George W. Bush as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. In 2005, he became permanent United States Representative to the United Nations, serving until 2006. It was, as you are aware, a period of historic change and immense controversy in American foreign policy, and our Speaker was at the center of it. In and out of government, John has been an outspoken advocate of American leadership in the global arena and of the need for reform of international institutions such as the United Nations, including some real estate changes to the headquarters building, I understand. Since leaving office, our Speaker has written a book that has been frequently cited, Surrender is Not an Option, Defending America at the United Nations. And he served as a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Although a staunch Republican, he does not hesitate to criticize the current administration when he believes that it has erred. His opposition to the 2007 agreement with North Korea on its nuclear program and the administration's current approach is a very, very current case in point. In fact, his critical views on this issue were reflected in John's favorite newspaper today, the New York Times, in an editorial that stated, quote, "The deal is far from perfect. It includes vague and confidential terms that could cause problems, but it is not the surrender that hardline critics are charging." They didn't have to mention your name in the editorial. In short, our Speaker is a man of vast experience in foreign affairs in general, in international organizations specifically. He's a man of strong and abiding convictions, and he is a man who has never shied away from controversy. Like you, I am looking forward to his remarks and our questions and answer sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming John Bolton to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here at the Baker Institute. Last time I was here was in 1997 when Secretary Baker was able to pull together what we called the Houston Accords on the Western Sahara to provide for a referendum to determine the future status of that territory, a referendum that has still not been held. This is another example of successful UN peacekeeping. A peacekeeping operation that we set up in 1991, and really it's only been around 17 years. You can't expect miracles in this sort of thing. But I am very glad to be here. You could say in some respects Secretary Baker is responsible for my career in government, which is a which is a problem he has to live down from time to time. But it is, in fact, true, since he brought me into the Reagan White House, and I'd have to say much of the rest is my responsibility, not his. But I have always thought it was an honor to work for him, and I said in my book, so I'm not just making it up for today's purposes, I think he's the best Secretary of State we've had in the last half of the 20th century, and I think history will bear that out. I want to... It does wonders for my relations with my last two Secretary of State bosses, too. But I wanted to talk about some of the challenges that the next American president will face, whoever it is, Senator Obama or Senator McCain. Challenges that I think have not been adequately addressed in the campaign, and given our current economic situation are not likely to be addressed in the next several weeks, but nonetheless challenges that will be on the President's desk on January the 20th. And in fact, there are so many of them I can't possibly get through them all, but I do want to talk about some of the critical ones, because decisions that the next president will make will have an impact not just during the 4 years of his first term, but really for decades to come. And let me start with what I think is the biggest conundrum we face over the long term, and that's the future of China. Many people in the United States see the development of China over the next several years as essentially following in a straight line from the past 20. Continued economic growth, continued increase in China's role in international affairs, and hopefully what some have called the peaceful rise of China to take its place in the international community. I think that is one possible scenario. But I would caution against straight-lining performance of only a 20-year period. China itself takes a much longer view. And if you, for example, just look at the last century of China and straight-line that, you'd have a very different perspective. As my colleague at AEI, Jim Lilly, a former ambassador to China, likes to say, they've had a bad century. In the last 100 years, you've seen the fall of the last imperial dynasty, the installation of the Republic of China, the first fall of the Republic of China, the return to authoritarian rule, the warlord period, the invasion of Japan, the occupation of much of China by the Japanese, driving the Japanese out, the civil war between the communists and the nationalists, the reinstitution of the Republic of China, the second fall of the Republic of China, the Great Leap Forward after the takeover by the communists of the mainland, the Great Leap Forward, resulting in the death of approximately 30 million Chinese, the worst human disaster in history, followed a decade later by the Cultural Revolution, which resulted in the destruction of more Chinese culture than any other time in history, followed then by the massive change in policy in Beijing, which then gave us the last 20 years. So the direction of China over the next several decades really depends on which perspective you take. And it's at least an alternative scenario that we need to keep in mind, that China will see another long period of discontinuity, perhaps of economic disruption. And let's not forget that the single most coherent political institution in China today remains the People's Liberation Army. And we can see the impact of its role in the expansion of the Chinese strategic missile force, of its acquisition of blue water naval capabilities, and the prospect of tension both across the Taiwan Straits and with other countries in Southeast Asia. Now, the American president, to be sure, is not going to be the only factor that helps determine China's future direction. But relations with the United States will be critical, I think, and the next president is going to have some major decisions that could well affect the direction that China takes in the future. One of those is going to be with respect to North Korea. I want to come back to that in a minute. Obviously, we all hope for better relations, continuing good relations, the peaceful rise of China, but it is not inevitable. Second, let's take the case of Russia, which the next president will have to deal with. Now, 12, 14 years ago, people would have considered Russia a basket case. It had an aging and declining population, problems that remain. The population of Russia is declining at the rate of about 700,000 people per year, and if that continues, the population will go from about 148 million today, perhaps to under 100 million by 2050, a very dramatic reduction. But because of the international price of oil, Russia's economy has gone from something roughly akin to the size of the Netherlands economy to one much larger, and the revenues from its sale of oil and natural gas have permitted it to modernize its military substantially and to revitalize its strategic nuclear forces as well. We can see the impact of the change that the oil revenue has brought in many of the policies that the Kremlin has undertaken recently under President, now under Prime Minister Putin. Recentralization of economic power, recentralization of political control. There are reports today, for example, in Vienna, that a Russian human rights lawyer has died perhaps from poisoning. It's sort of a thing going on now. If it's not poison, it's polonium-210. It's amazing the way enemies of the leadership in the Kremlin tend to disappear. And so pervasive is the political control that in the last presidential election, not close by anybody's standards, President Medvedev won with over 80% of the vote. School teachers told their students, your parents better vote the right way or your grades will suffer. Now, I call that attention to detail when you're fixing an election. And it's no wonder that we worry about the direction of Russia when we see things like the invasion of Georgia on August the 8th. Now, some people say that this was really provoked by the Georgians, that their behavior gave just cause for the Russians to come in. I think that the size, the scope, the planning behind the Russian military incursion showed this was contemplated long before. It was just a question of which provocation the Russians seized, and I think that the response of the West has been entirely inadequate. And I think that began last spring when our European friends rejected President Bush's suggestion to put Georgia and Ukraine on the path to formal NATO membership. I think Moscow read that as a sign of weakness. I think they see a gap between the eastern border of NATO and the western border of Russia. I think we had advance warning of what they had in mind 3 years ago when then President Putin said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I think most of us thought it was a pretty fine way to end the century. That's not the predominant view in Moscow, and history may look back at the invasion of Georgia and say this was the beginning of Putin's effort to reverse that catastrophe and recreate the space, or at least the dominance of Russia in that space of the former Soviet Union. Not that this is a new Cold War. This is, I think, really more accurately seen as a reversion to Tsarism in Russian behavior. But it poses enormous difficulties. I think there's a major strategic interest for the United States in making sure that there is a pipeline corridor out of the Caspian Sea region that does not run either through Iran or Russia. That's what Georgia represents, among other things. And I think it's clearly one of the interests that the Russians have in mind in closing off. So the next president is going to have to deal with this question and with really what is one of the third major problems for the United States in the coming years, and that's the continuing decline of Europe as an effective player in international affairs. I think their performance during the invasion and subsequent to the invasion of Russia has been inadequate and very weak. I think it's an encouragement to further belligerent behavior on the part of Russians, and I think this is a phenomenon that's not going to change. If anything, it will accelerate. Now, this will come as a fine irony to many people who argued over the years that greater European political integration would actually make Europe as a whole, the European Union, an alternative pillar to the United States in world affairs. This was certainly the view of leaders in countries like France and Germany that actively encouraged greater European political integration. But I think the result in practice has actually been exactly the opposite. Today, Europe is less than the sum of its parts. And I think that the continuing uncertainty over the fate of the European Constitution, call it whatever you will, that's what it was intended to be, and that's what it fundamentally still is. Until that gets resolved, and maybe even after that, Europe will not be an effective player in international affairs. And I think that they understand that the problems that they face demographically are problems that are not going to be solved anytime in the near future, so that this whole effort at politically integrating Europe actually is causing more difficulty for them than they anticipated. That is bad news for the United States. We would be much better off with a stronger Europe of nations not politically integrated, where more countries were able to set their own policies. I think we would find greater support in international affairs than we're likely to from a Europe that remains in continuing decline. And let me just say there that although we can see in the papers today, coming from Europe, coming from some in the United States as well, the confident prophecy that our current economic circumstance means the end of the unipolar moment, the end of American hegemony. Just one statistic that emerges in the past few weeks. If you look at the decline in the American stock market from its 52-week high in October of last year, we've had a decline, depending on how you calculate today's modest drop, of around 32 or 33%. That's a horrible decline, no doubt about it. But every other major stock market in the world has gone down at least that much. The Shanghai stock market has declined by 62% from a 52-week high only 9 months ago. The Hang Seng is down over 40%. The Nikkei is down over 40%. The indexes for all the major European markets are down by more than the Dow. It's hard to see how the current economic circumstance makes for any major change in the relationship among the economies in the world. Everyone is suffering, some more than others, certainly not the United States more than others. But the next president will also have not only these large questions to resolve, they'll have some immediate pressures as well that will require decisions almost from the first day in office. Because I think that the continuing threats of international terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological, have to remain at the center of the new president's attention, because these threats are current and remain of acute interest, not just to the United States, but to friends and allies around the world. And let me just survey a couple of them. In North Korea, we have a state that meets by any definition the standards of international kleptocracy. This is a state that will sell anything to anybody. It sells illegal narcotics through its diplomatic pouches. It counterfeits American money so successfully that Secretary Baker's former Treasury Department colleagues call these bills super bills. It is the world's largest proliferator of ballistic missile technology into regimes in the Middle East in particular. And its continuing nuclear program is an issue that the next president is going to be faced with in very immediate terms, whatever the actual health of Kim Jong-il. And I don't think we really know what his health is. I think that's the biggest state secret in North Korea, probably even more important than the nuclear program itself. Now, I've been arguing for the past 7 or 8 years that you cannot understand North Korea in the context only of a threat in Northeast Asia. In fact, my worry about North Korea is that it's a global threat, and that in particular, North Korea is one of the main troublemakers in the Middle East, a country that has a surfeit of troublemakers already. And I don't think you can have a more graphic demonstration of North Korea's activity than the nuclear reactor that it was constructing on the banks of the Euphrates River in Syria, destroyed by the Israeli Air Force last September the 6th. This reactor, as best we can tell, a clone of the aging, decrepit reactor at Yongbyon, could well have been in North Korea's planning the way it would keep its nuclear program going even after it had agreed to shut down Yongbyon. We were quite ignorant of that reactor until last spring when Israeli intelligence brought us information about it. But I think we had failed to note the possibility that Syria would be interested in a nuclear program for some time. One of the controversies that dogged me in my confirmation battle was a controversy over testimony that I had to give in the fall of 2003 on Syrian interest in weapons of mass destruction. And while a lot of it's still confidential, suffice it to say that what I wanted to argue was that Syria was, in fact, interested in a nuclear capability. And our intelligence community, in their infinite wisdom, said, no, we don't think that's correct. We're not going to agree for you to say what you want to say for two basic reasons. First, that Syria lacked the technical capability for a nuclear program, and second, that they lacked the financial wherewithal to create such a program. Well, North Korea can supply the technical deficiencies, and with oil at the prices it has been, I think Iran could certainly supply the financial background. I think we will come to learn, perhaps not for decades, but we will come to learn that that reactor on the Euphrates River was a three-way joint venture between Iran, North Korea, and Syria, with Iran supplying the money, North Korea the construction, and Syria the venue. Because in many ways, Iran and North Korea have a very common interest in hiding what they're doing from the prying eyes of international inspectors. And if you're North Korea or Iran and want to hide a nuclear program, what better place to hide it than in Syria, where nobody is looking? We have known for years that Iran and North Korea have cooperated extensively on ballistic missiles. If you go back to 1998, when North Korea launched a ballistic missile called the Taepodong-2 that landed in the Pacific east of Japan, it stirred up an enormous international controversy, especially in Japan, because they realized that if North Korea was capable of landing a missile east of Japan, they could land one on Japan as well. And the North Koreans, seeing the controversy that ensued from this, in 1999 made a pledge that they would forego launch testing of ballistic missiles from the Korean Peninsula. So they scored two enormous propaganda victories. First, from launching the Taepodong to show that they could do it, and second, from apparently forswearing from substantial further development of their missile program. But all that they did, beginning in 1999, was shift the emphasis of their missile development to Iran. Both countries had their missile programs based on the same Soviet-era Scud missile technology, and Iran, ever since then, has been sharing telemetry and other data with North Korea. So that North Korea had the benefit for years of saying, we're not pursuing ballistic missile testing, when in fact their testing was being done, subcontracted in effect, to Iran. Now, we've never known whether there was nuclear cooperation between Iran and North Korea during that period. But the evidence of this Syrian reactor, I think, is powerful support for the proposition that the programs that they were talking about made the axis of evil much more than a metaphor. Because these ballistic missile programs are not based on abstract interest in physics. They're designed to create a capacity to deliver weapons on target, and particularly nuclear weapons. So the outcome of our current discussions with North Korea will have an impact not simply in Northeast Asia, but in the Middle East and around the world as well. And I think the plain and simple fact is that Kim Jong-il's regime is never voluntarily going to give up nuclear weapons. That capability is the trump card they have against the United States, against South Korea, Japan, really the trump card they hold against their own people. And I think that therefore, efforts to talk the North Koreans out of their weapons are not going to succeed, because we're not going to have the kind of verification we need in that incredibly closed society ever to have confidence that that in fact the North Koreans are being serious about any commitment they've made to give up nuclear weapons. And of course, over the past 16 years, they've made 4 separate commitments to give up nuclear weapons. They've just never seemed to find the time to get around to it. So the next president now is going to be faced with a situation where much of our leverage over the North has been given up by delisting North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism. They will find we have driven a wedge between ourselves and our closest ally in the Pacific, Japan, over a very emotional issue for the Japanese because of North Korean kidnapping of Japanese citizens over the years. You can say, well, that's not really a critical strategic issue. It's happened 20 years ago. These people are all probably dead and gone, and it's really just emotional and a matter of domestic politics. All I can say to that is imagine if the North Koreans had been kidnapping Americans over the years. Imagine how we would feel about it, and imagine particularly how those Japanese who really followed this matter know about the pressure they would face from a nuclear-capable North Korea that could drop a Taepodong missile on one of their cities. The fact that North Korea remains devoid of any evidence that it's given up its strategic objective of keeping nuclear weapons in many respects is reflected in the behavior of the government in Iran. Iran has been pursuing nuclear weapons for at least 20 years on a clandestine basis. It has repeatedly withheld information from the International Atomic Energy Agency. It has lied to the IAEA. It has destroyed evidence. It has bulldozed sites in Iran to prevent the IAEA from finding nuclear work that's gone on. In fact, it's done nearly everything in its own behavior known to the IAEA to convince people that they're trying to cover something up. The Iranian program, if you simply look at what has already been disclosed in IAEA reports, is progressing very rapidly towards a weapons capability. They have already, just from what the IAEA itself knows, produced enough low-enriched uranium for, if it were enriched to weapons-grade uranium, would be enough for 1/2 of a nuclear weapon, and their progress in the uranium enrichment program makes it clear that that capacity is going to be increasing dramatically in the next several years. The Iranians claim that they simply want civil nuclear power for as an alternative to the oil and natural gas that they possess, that they claim is wasting away. A few years ago, I asked our Department of Energy to look into the Iranian claims that their oil and natural gas assets were declining, and the Energy Department said, well, in fact, the Iranians are right. At their current rate of domestic consumption and export, Iran will run out of oil and natural gas in 350 or 400 years. So, of course, it's only a matter of basic prudence to find alternative sources of energy when that is disappearing. The Iranians have a number of objectives. I think the most difficult for us to understand, and perhaps the most difficult to understand around the world, is the struggle within Islam between its Shiite and Sunni branches. I think this is being played out by Iran in a number of other respects in its support for international terrorism, what Secretary Rice has called Iran's role as the central banker of terrorism around the world, its support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, for Hamas in the Gaza Strip, even for its once sworn enemy, the Taliban in Afghanistan. Which shows in support for Hamas and Taliban, which are Sunni-based groups, that there's a larger goal here as well beyond the conflict within Islam, and that's hegemony in the Middle East. That's why the question of the withdrawal of American forces from Iraq is so important. Not only does it affect the internal situation in Iraq, it affects the feeling of our friends and allies in the Arab world, on the southern shore of the Persian Gulf near Iran. They live there. They're not going to be able to withdraw. And if they see America turning its back on the region, they're very practical people. They will make accommodation with the Iranians, which can only be to our detriment over the long term. Now, Iran, I think, poses a special example of of the difficulty of dealing with a state that's determined to acquire nuclear weapons. And this is an area where, unfortunately, I happen to disagree with Secretary Baker, and it's always painful to do that, but I will try and explain my thinking on this, especially in light of the claims that some have made that if we could only sit down and negotiate with Iran over its nuclear program, surely we could find a way to resolve it. Well, the fact is that we have had 5 years plus of negotiation with Iran through our European friends, Britain, France, and Germany, what we've called the EU3. For 5 years, they have been saying to Iran, if only you would suspend your uranium enrichment program, you could have a different relationship with us and with the United States. From the outset, Iran has known that the Europeans were essentially there in our stead, and that it wasn't just the Europeans who were negotiating. And indeed, 3 years ago, we made it clear to Iran that if they would follow what the Europeans had been saying and suspend uranium enrichment, in fact, we would sit down at the table. Despite their continuing support for terrorism, we would engage with them on the nuclear question. And for essentially 5 straight years, the Iranians have said, we're not going to give up uranium enrichment, we're not going to give up what they consider to be their right to nuclear power, and there are no inducements that you can offer us to get us to change that view. And in the language of diplomacy, of incentives and disincentives, carrots and sticks, I can assure you that our European friends have negotiated their little hearts out on this. They've offered the Iranians every carrot they could think of, and the Iranians have consistently said, we're not buying. So here's a case where those who say, well, why don't we negotiate with the Iranians? What have we got to lose? Where we can see what there is to lose, because negotiation is like any other human activity. It has costs as well as benefits. And the cost of 5 years plus of failed European negotiation is that Iran today is 5 years closer to a nuclear weapons capability. During that 5-year period, the Iranians were able to overcome the numerous difficult scientific and technological hurdles to getting completely indigenous control over the nuclear fuel cycle, which I think they clearly have now. That 5 years is an asset that they couldn't have bought for love or money. Time almost always works on the side of the proliferator, and this is a clear case where time has worked to the advantage of the Iranians. So for somebody to say today, as an unnamed presidential candidate has, well, I'll sit down and talk to the Iranians, that's a very fine idea. It was 5 years ago anyway. It's not the same idea today. And the consequence of even further delay, I think, can only be more to the detriment of the United States as Iran gets ever closer actually to being able to assemble a deliverable nuclear weapon. Now, the Bush administration had said for some time that a nuclear weapons-capable Iran was unacceptable. And I used to say, I think the word unacceptable means it's unacceptable. I was obviously wrong about that, but it's not just the United States that's concerned about an Iranian nuclear weapons program. It's also the Gulf Arab states and Israel. And I think you would have to say today, given Israel's record of destroying the Osirak reactor outside of Baghdad in 1981, the destruction in September of last year of the North Korean reactor in Syria, that if the Israelis contemplate that Iran amounts to an existential threat to the state of Israel, that they will not hesitate to act. Now, this is an incredibly risky and dangerous proposition. The chances of success are problematic at best. But I think that as unattractive as the military option is, that another presidential candidate who has said the only thing more unattractive than the military option is an Iran with nuclear weapons has it about right. So it may be, depending on the internal political situation in Israel, which is as confused as I think anyone has ever seen it, it may be that Israel will come to a decision on the use of military force against Iran before the inauguration of our next president, so that the so that the situation in the region at that time could be something that will require immediate action, or it could be something that erupts within the first year of the next president's tenure. Now, all of these proliferation problems, as difficult as they are in and of themselves, don't stop there, because everybody is watching what happens with North Korea and what happens with Iran. And countries are making decisions right now based on whether North Korea keeps its nuclear weapons program and Iran is able to acquire them. In Northeast Asia, where China says that stability is its highest objective to help foster economic development, a nuclear North Korea could prompt Japan, hard as it may be to imagine, but could prompt Japan to decide it needs a nuclear weapons capability. That could spread to other nations there as well. That won't be good for stability or anybody's economic development. In the Middle East, if Iran is able to acquire nuclear weapons capability, other countries will do the same, possibly Saudi Arabia, possibly Egypt, possibly Turkey, possibly others. All of that is going to make for a much less safe Middle East and a much more dangerous world. So that our attention to these questions of proliferation, I think, has to be at the very top of the next president's agenda. Obviously, on January the 20th, either Senator Obama or Senator McCain will have a lot of competing priorities, but I hope we could all agree that the safety of the United States and its friends and allies around the world ought to be at the top of that list. And that's why I think all of us as citizens and voters, when we consider who we're going to support in November, recognizing the range of other issues we face, will put national security at the top of our priority list. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Bolton is open to taking questions from the audience. Just if you could just identify yourself and ask your question, and he will respond.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Lee, Houston, Texas. I heard coming over here today about Pakistan and what's happening in Pakistan as the Taliban are going back and forth again, and that the French have gotten in there and they're predicting we need 400,000 troops there to take care of the problems in Afghanistan. I was wondering your comments about how do we get Pakistan and what's happening there.
Yeah, I actually think Afghanistan itself is less of a problem for us going forward than it has been, despite all of the concern about the deteriorating situation. I think you have to look at Afghanistan in context, and for 500 years, give or take a few, it's never had a strong central government. So contrasting what we have today with the past, I think, shows that it's not that far out of the ordinary. I think the Taliban remains a problem, but they are not coordinating on a national basis. I think the major step we need to take is a more vigorous drug eradication program to deny Taliban and other essentially warlord cliques in Afghanistan now access to the finance that they have to keep their insurrection going. I actually think Pakistan is a worse problem in the sense that I think the radical Islamicists have targeted Pakistan as a place that actually is more susceptible to state collapse and state failure than some other places, and from the radical perspective, is a much more inviting target because of its arsenal of nuclear weapons. Now, I don't think in Pakistan today the Islamicist radicals could win an election or even come close. I think they're actually a very small percentage of the population. But the fact is that under the new government we have, the risks of incompetence and corruption remain large, and dissatisfaction and instability in the society are large and I think will grow. And that is the environment in which the radicals could seize control. Even if there's only instability, if the Pakistani military lost command and control over even a few of its nuclear weapons, that would be enormously troubling. And the worst case scenario was the government itself collapsed and the radicals took control. Then you would have a radical Islamist state with dozens of nuclear weapons. And that would bring the threat that Iran poses to immediate reality. So I think that this is yet another on the list of high priorities for the next president, and one that I'm not sure has been discussed very clearly, let me put it that way, in our existing presidential debate so far. Yes, sir.
I'm Aubrey Farb. I have a twofold question. First, what is your opinion of our planning to place missiles in Eastern Europe? And second, what do you make of the overtures that China and Taiwan are engaging in at the present time?
Yeah. Well, let me address the second question first, because I do think that's important. You know, for the 8 years of Chen Shui-bian's term as president of Taiwan, there were enormous tensions across the Taiwan Straits based on the long-standing platform of his political party to declare Taiwanese independence. And with the election of Ma Ying-jeou as the president of Taiwan, there was a real possibility, I think many people thought, for a lessening of tensions and easing of long-term restrictions on trade, travel, investment between Taiwan and the mainland. And Ma Ying-jeou campaigned, and I think won election in Taiwan on the promise of greater economic prosperity, because Taiwan had been stagnating compared to the dynamic growth of the Chinese mainland and much of the rest of Asia. Ma Ying-jeou has now made a number of very significant overtures to Beijing at political risk to his future on Taiwan, and Beijing has not yet responded. Now, I don't know the reasons for that. I don't think it necessarily indicates it's going to be a negative response, but I think it's important for Beijing to understand that they should reciprocate to what Ma has proposed, and quickly, because otherwise, if Ma's fortunes fall and the economic circumstances we're in put him in a difficult position politically in Taiwan, this moment may be lost, and to the detriment of both Beijing and Taipei. Second, on the question of the anti-missile system, you know, I was in charge of, I was the chief negotiator with Russia in 2001 under President Bush's plan to get us out of the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty. And the reason for that was that President Bush believed that the strategic environment we lived in had changed dramatically, that we didn't face a nuclear threat from Russia. What we faced was a threat of small numbers of nuclear weapons coming our way from various rogue states, so that what we needed was exactly what was prohibited by the ABM Treaty. We needed a national missile defense covering our entire territory, but one that was limited to dealing with launches by rogue states of handfuls of missiles, not hundreds or thousands. And we explained this to the Russians. The President explained it, Secretary Powell explained it, all the way down the line. It was explained to them what we were doing. And in fact, when we withdrew in late 2001, then President Putin said, well, he wished we hadn't done it, but there were many other things on our agenda, and he didn't make any fuss about it. And in fact, we then went on to negotiate the Treaty of Moscow, bringing down our level of operationally deployed strategic nuclear weapons, which was something that we would have done anyway, but which we negotiated in treaty form with Russia because President Putin said that he needed it. So when I hear leading Russians today say that this is the basing of radars or missiles in Eastern Europe is a provocative act, that it poses a threat to Russia, this is utter nonsense. They know why the sites are being selected in Eastern Europe, and they know that those sites are not a threat to Russia. And how do they know that? Look at a globe. the launch trajectories for Russian missiles, if they were going to attack the United States, go over the pole. That's why back in Cold War days, the DEW line, remember the DEW line, the distant early warning line, was in Canada and Alaska, not in Western Europe. The positioning of those sites in Poland and the Czech Republic is to protect us in Western Europe against launches from Iran, not from Russia. So I think this is this has to be deliberately playing for the domestic political audience in Russia, intended to intimidate the Europeans, an objective easier today than it should be, and one that is just based on not based at all on any kind of objective reality. I think it's important to continue to explain that so that people don't think that these claims by Russia have any objective merit. Yes, sir.
Could Your Excellency tell us what happened between the backdoor negotiations between Israel and Syria, especially after Ehud Olmert is gone? Are still negotiations going on, or what happened?
A question about negotiations between Israel and Syria. I'd have to say I honestly don't know what they're doing, and I don't think there's much chance for success. I think that the success Iran has had over the years in steadily building up its influence over the government of Syria has made it at this point all but impossible for the Syrians to break away. And I think that, in fact, this is one of the reasons why the Arab response to Israel's destruction of the North Korean reactor was so muted. Here you have a situation where the Israeli military has whacked a brother Arab state badly, and yet the other Arab countries stood silent. I think because they appreciate, and certainly people have said this to me in private conversations, that they understand that that reactor was symbolic of Iranian influence in Syria. They didn't want a nuclear Syria any more than they want a nuclear Iran. I think it's a mistake to think that the Arab reaction, therefore, to the use of military force against Iran's program, as undesirable as that would be. I think it would be a mistake to believe that the Arab reaction would be as negative as many people think. They don't want a nuclear Iran any more than Israel does. So what that tells me is that much of the discussions between Iran and Syria had more to do with Prime Minister Olmert's political travails than they did with serious negotiations. So what will happen when there's a new Israeli government will depend on whether there's a new Israeli government, if and when that comes to pass. And I think it's just too hard to predict what that will look like at the moment. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. I'm Susie Hoyer, and a friend of Jenny Roshak. And a more philosophical question. Throughout the centuries, we've had the century of the British Empire, the Holland, the Spain, and Luce decreed that the last century was the American century. What do you think is going to be happening in this coming century? Do you think that Brazil or Russia or India or the EU or China, when we look back, what century will this be called? Do you think America will still prevail?
Yeah. Well, 10 years ago, I was part of the board of directors of a little group called the Project for a New American Century, which tells you what direction I think it's going in. That was another subject of controversy. But I think you have to have a little humility looking ahead on a variety of fronts. And as I mentioned, the comparative fall in stock markets around the world, I don't see that it's inevitable that any of the so-called rising economies are going to overtake us in sort of simplistic straightlining from their current circumstances. Remember back in the 1990s when Japan was going to overtake us. Well, that didn't last very long. But obviously the future depends on the policies that we adopt. And I think on the domestic front, where it will affect us most, the lessons we learned from the panic of 2008 are going to be critical. And if we draw the wrong conclusions and put the wrong economic policies in place, as many are hastening to suggest, we will find our economic recovery straightened. And I'm just understand we have to take extraordinary steps when we face a market crisis like this. But if we conclude that dramatic reforms need to be made in the structuring of our entire economy, I think we will hobble ourselves. And what that tells me is that the real lesson of who will dominate in the 21st century depends fundamentally on choices that the United States will make in its own domestic politics, more than anything else. Yes, sir.
Mr. Bolton, first of all, thank you so much for coming in and giving such an enlightening talk. I'm Dr. Imam, and I'm basically from Pakistan, so I thought I'd share some of my opinions with the audience over here and then ask a couple of questions. First of all, I think you're very right when you say that Pakistan is at a juncture today where it's a make-or-break situation. And while the extremists cannot win an election in Pakistan today, unfortunately, they've started advancing more and more towards the south. They were limited to a short belt of tribal areas, but now, as most of you might have read in the papers, they've now progressed all the way to our capital. And it's not seldom that we've had suicide bombings over there. And as a person over here and with my family back there, it really concerns me when they're progressing to such a great extent. And economically, security-wise, Pakistan is really not going in the direction where anyone in Pakistan or anyone in the world would want it to go, because instability, economic deprivation, these are all things that foment terrorism and have been doing that in the past. The other thing is that the approach that's been maintained as yet against the terrorism in Afghanistan as well as the tribal areas of Pakistan is to go ahead and do a blanket bombing. Now, the problem as a Pakistani that I see over there is that you end up killing 5 terrorists, which is the objective, but you also end up killing 2 innocent people. And those 2 innocent people have 3 brothers, 5 brothers. They have large families in Pakistan. And what that produces is that from an initial 10 terrorists, you've ended up killing 5 people, which you want to eliminate. But you've also created 20 other people who are now willing to take revenge on the people of Pakistan and on all other Western nations. And that has actually entered us into a vicious cycle where the number of terrorists, instead of decreasing, is increasing. So I would want your opinion as to what can the United States do as an economic support, political or diplomatic support, or other avenues to address this issue of terrorism to actually cut it down and not to propagate it further. The other issue is that, in your opinion, a number of people in Pakistan, myself included, think that the root cause of all this terrorism originates from the Middle East. Do you think Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon? I fully support the fact. But do you think the United States need to employ a more balanced approach in the Middle East vis-a-vis Israel and the rest of the Muslim world? Because why should Israel have a nuclear weapon system when the rest of the world cannot have that? The other issue is regarding the nuclear agreement with India. As a Pakistani, that concerns me, and I would want your opinion on that as well. And the third is that we've always looked towards the United States as a country that has supported democracy all around the world. It has supported its principles and stayed on it. But recently, what we've seen is that a number of dictators all around the world have been supported by the administration. Musharraf was an example in our country. Hosni Mubarak remains an example in Egypt. And all the kingdoms in the Middle East, including Morocco in Africa, remain closely allied with the U.S., and that's not doing a great favor to the people. So your opinion on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, you've raised a number of issues that show why the next president's going to be so busy. But let me take at least a few of them. I think in terms of dealing with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in the federally administered tribal areas, that there's no question if you asked our military, they would do almost anything to avoid having to engage in the kind of air assaults that have occurred and would much have preferred to find ways to cooperate with the government of Pakistan since 9/11 to deal with the problem on the ground, which is where it really has to be dealt with. But Musharraf, who cooperated in many, many other respects, felt he was just simply beyond him politically to do that. I think under the new civilian government, the situation will be worse. I think they will find it even more difficult to cooperate with the United States. So in that sense, I heard what you said about Musharraf before, but I think we will come back, we will look back on the Musharraf era as the kind of good old days in terms of cooperation against the terrorists. And I think this is a matter of acute concern because I think radical Islamicists are growing in strength within the Pakistani military. And given the difficulty the democratically elected governments have had, that's why the people of Pakistan call the military the iron skeleton. It's what holds the country together. If that becomes, and you can see it in the generations, the younger officers tend to be more Islamicist, the older officers trained in the United States and elsewhere feeling much closer to us are moving on in years, and as the younger officers become more senior officers, I think that's going to be more of a problem. With respect to dealings with India, my own feeling is that the nuclear deal that was negotiated with India was not a terribly good bargain from the U.S. point of view. I think too much of the Indian program, the nuclear program, remains beyond the scope of effective constraint. But I think that there was no doubt that we were going to have to deal with India and Pakistan's nuclear programs. I think the Clinton administration policy was a dead end. There was no way either India or Pakistan would give up their nuclear capabilities once they had them, and the idea that they would and join the Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states was completely misguided. And I think it's been a major success over the past 8 years that we, for the first time, I think, since independence and partition of the subcontinent, have been able to decouple the India-Pakistan relationship. We have better relations now with India and better relations with Pakistan in the aggregate than I think we've ever had before. So the issue, the possibility for more progress exists, but it would be blinking at reality not to appreciate that the risk of nuclear confrontation on the subcontinent remains large. Now, on the subject of Israel's nuclear capability, it's been the position of U.S. administrations for decades that we want a nuclear-free Middle East. No doubt about that. But I would have to say, if some of the radicals got their wish and Israel just disappeared tomorrow, the problem of a nuclear Iran would not go away, and the problem of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East would not go away because it stems from other causes in addition to Israel. And in many respects, I think that we shouldn't believe that if sweetness and light broke out between Arabs and Israelis, that all of the other problems of the Middle East would go away either. I'm not sure they would even be materially changed.
Okay. Oh, thanks for coming, Mr. Bolton. From all your talk, I have the impression that the Middle East and the Far East are the core of the new president's foreign policy. What's about the closest neighbors of Latin America? What's about the role? And basically, I have two questions. The first one, well, I am a Mexican PhD student at Rice. So what's about immigration policy with Mexico? I mean, we are the closest neighbors of the USA, so I think that this issue could not be disregarded by any foreign policy. And the second question is, what is your opinion about the rising of leftist regimes in South America, basically the recent change in Ecuador with Mr. Correa, the position of Mr. Chavez in Venezuela, or the future of Cuba? So I would like to know a little bit more, what is the position, what is the Republican perspective in your Republican perspective about these issues? Thank you.
Well, thank you. On the immigration question, my view is that immigration is a net plus for the United States. It always has been, and that we should be more open to immigration and more open to solving the problem of illegal immigration. I went through in the Reagan administration what was called the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, some others will remember, where we were going to have stronger controls at the border, solving the problem of existing illegals, and more sanctions against employers hiring illegals, and that was going to solve the problem. Well, so here we are 20 years later, and the issues still exist. The fact is, we're going to have immigration as long as it's viewed as desirable to live in the United States as opposed to fill in the blank, and I think that's going to go on for a long time. The line that I would draw is not trying to keep immigrants out, but returning to what I think was critical, the successful philosophy of the United States, critically important to our country at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, and that's Americanization. It's not politically correct to talk about that now, but the fact is that that's what e pluribus unum means, not Al Gore, out of one, many. It's the exact opposite. It's out of many, one. And I think that if you look at the history of the melting pot, it's been remarkably successful. And if we insist on Americanization for new immigrants wherever they come from, it will be successful into the future. That doesn't mean you cut off immigration. It means you make people into Americans when they get here, and if they're not willing to do that, then there's someplace else they can go. But that leaves me, so that is a position favored by neither major political party, as best I can tell. In terms of larger threats within the hemisphere, every new American president comes into office and says we need to pay more attention to the Western Hemisphere. Everyone does it, and then all of them get distracted by something else. But I think that we are at an important point, and I think Chavez does pose a threat to the United States, but mostly to the other countries in South and Central America. I don't know what it is that sort of rattles around between his two ears. I don't think it's Marxist-Leninism in the classic sense. It's sort of confused. I once heard President Bush call Chavez Castro without brains. But in some respects, in many respects, he is more dangerous than Castro because of the price of oil. He is not constrained for resources. The Soviets always kept Castro on a pretty tight leash to advance their priorities, and Castro was always, therefore, really subject to outside control. Nothing controls Chavez. And he has interfered, as you've said, in democratic elections in Peru, in Bolivia, in Ecuador. He tried to fix the recount in the past Mexican presidential election, something I paid particular attention to. He's bought Argentina's debt in a way that's had a profound impact on that country's policies. So the oil revenues that he gets have given him much broader sway in the hemisphere than Castro ever could have had. Now we see that he is growing closer to Moscow. He's purchased extraordinary quantities of weapons from Russia that he certainly doesn't need for the Venezuelan army. Many people think they've gone to the FARC in Colombia. I think he crossed a real line when he agreed to Russia building nuclear reactors in Venezuela. That's always the start. Of course, they're for peaceful civil purposes too. We've seen Chavez in Tehran. This is something that I do think poses a real risk for the United States, and I think the most encouraging thing there is that leaders around Latin America, even leaders on the left of the political spectrum, have come to see that Chavez does represent a threat to the relatively fragile democracies in many countries in the region. And we would be best if we could find a way to have Latin American leaders deal with Chavez, help the people in Venezuela deal with Chavez. But I do think that the next president really needs to focus on this in a very serious way. Well, thank you all very much for coming tonight. I enjoyed it.